Casey, it's Jim. I wanted to do a response video to Ryan Smith, who has just recently discovered Cocteau Twins and mentioned me in a video about it, I think because I made a video about dream pop and shoegaze, and probably end up mentioning Cocteau Twins in just about every video I make. But the first thing I want to say is Ryan's got a great channel, and if you haven't subscribed to Ryan, you should check him out. And it's great to see somebody discover a band for the first time that meant a lot to you, to me in this case. It's really kind of cool to see. I started listening to Cocteau Twins as they came out. It seems like forever ago. I guess it's been like 35 or more years, which is crazy. And they had a pretty big effect on my taste in music and just sort of the way that I experienced music. It was a sound that I hadn't come across before them, or at least their music developed into that. Cocteau Twins were a shoegaze dream pop band from Scotland and consisted mainly of two people, Elizabeth Fraser and Robin Guthrie. They had a couple other semi-permanent members, the majority of which was Simon Raymond later in the project. Originally Will Heggie on bass, and he was replaced by Simon Raymond, who played mainly bass, but he also played a lot of other instruments for them. I'd say that they were shoegaze / dream pop, but really they kind of developed the sound, so they were really one of the creators of that. Though like all genres, it's kind of a continuum, one from another, kind of morphing from one sound to another sound. Early on, their influences were really post-punk, Susie and the Banshees, and Birthday Party, and that kind of crowd that was happening at the time. A lot of the early 4AD stuff, Rima, and other things were having an effect on them as well. But what I wanted to do was just kind of quickly go through the records that I have and talk about the phases of their career, mostly for the benefit of Ryan, who is really asking about what he should listen to. He's been exposed to two records. One was Heaven or Las Vegas, which is very near the end of their career, and Treasure, which is pretty much fairly near the beginning of their career. And so they're kind of bookending different phases in their career. But in my mind, Treasure is in the middle, Heaven or Las Vegas is at the end, and there's another phase at the beginning. And so I wanted to kind of briefly go over those and just walk through the records real quick. So their first record is called Garlands, and that is this guy here. Garlands came out in 1982, and this is a 4AD pressing from 1982. And this is one of the earlier 23 envelope covers. And the reason I mention that is that the cover art becomes a kind of a central part of the story of 4AD and the story of Cocteau Twins. And this is very early in the development of that graphic design studio. The sound for Garlands was really post-punk. It was really kind of the birth of goth, and it's much darker than where they'd go. I think the mix is muddier. Elizabeth Fraser's vocals are kind of a little more aggressive and a little sharper, not as refined as she'll get. A great record, but a record that I think was more impactful at the time, because, you know, it felt like sort of where Susie and the Banshees could have gone, where Susie went in much more of a pop direction. Cocteau Twins kind of took it in a little heavier, a little bit more introspective direction, much more like the early Susie records. The next record that Cocteau Twins came out with was an EP called Lullabies, which is this one here. And I always loved this cover because it's just, you know, this is an old Victorian photograph of a woman dancing that looks like a lily, and then there's a on the back cover. I always loved that. Again, 4AD, custom label. And this came out just a few months after Garlands, so it was similar sound, but they kind of got a little bit more polished with this. The feathers or blades, elastized, how was it? Yeah, all but an arc lark. I'm trying to remember what's on this record. Yeah, feathers or blades, all but an arc lark, and elastized laughing. All three of those are really kind of great tracks. I think they had more energy and more interest than Garlands. But where they really started to kick in and get going was the next record, which is not Sunburst and Snowblind. I've completely zoned out on this. Head Over Heels. I always do that. I always mix up Sunburst and Snowblind and Head Over Heels because the covers are so similar. And Head Over Heels was really where they started to develop where they would go with their sound, but it still has that kind of more, a little rougher sense to it. By this time, I believe Heggie had gone, and they had brought in Simon Raymond. I believe that's correct. And then another EP that came out in this time frame is Peppermint Pig, another good, but still feels a little like the early sound. So this is still what I would consider the first phase of who they are. And then the EP Sunburst and Snowblind, this is starting to develop into their more mature sound by this point. These are not terribly easy to get here. Some of these I've had to get from overseas because you just don't come across them here. The EPs, a lot of the albums have been repressed, and so they're a little easier to get, but the EPs not so much. That was followed by another EP called Akiagini. Actually, I don't think this technically had a title, but the songs are Akiagini, Kookaburra, Quisquos, Rococo. I have no idea if I'm slaughtering those names or not, but most likely I am. But the music's beautiful. That was followed by another EP called The Spangle Maker. And this had two songs that I thought were really instrumental in kind of defining their mature sound, which was The Spangle Maker and Pearly Dewdrops Drops. I think they had some chart success in the UK with both of those, but I think especially Pearly Dewdrops Drops. And for me as a designer, these covers are just getting better and better. 23 Envelope is doing a great job of creating just these beautiful covers. So that's followed up by Treasure, which is one of the records that Ryan is familiar with. And this is a beautiful record. To me, this was their first truly great record. There's not a bad track on this. It still has a little bit of the darkness of the earlier records, but not not in the kind of density that you'd have in the earlier records. It's much lighter in ways, but it's also ethereal is the word that people always use to describe Cocteau Twins, but it's a deserving term. Beautiful record. Followed up by more EPs, Echoes in a Shallow Bay, and Tiny Dynamine. I have the original Echoes in a Shallow Bay on 4AD. They were really, really productive with EPs, and they put out a lot of amazing music on EPs rather than just kind of producing a record and then producing another, I should say producing an album and then producing another album, like most artists. Tiny Dynamine, I wasn't able to track down, but they did repress it as essentially they compressed Tiny Dynamine and Echoes in a Shallow Bay onto one, and that's what this is. So I have Echoes in a Shallow Bay twice, but that's how I got Tiny Dynamine. That was followed up by this record, which has just such a beautiful cover. I don't know if it comes across, but it's just got this, it reminds me, the cover actually reminds me of, I think it's Metal by Pink Floyd. Just a beautiful, sort of rich, tonal image. This is Love's Easy Tears, if I didn't mention that. And that's another 4-track EP. And then that was actually followed up by another, this is almost a side project. It's called The Moon and the Melodies. And this is Harold Budd with Cocteau Twins, but they didn't actually put their name on it as Cocteau Twins, so it's Harold Budd, Robin Guthrie, Elizabeth Fraser, and Simon Raymond. But it's a really beautiful, more, I wouldn't call it ambient, but it has ambient influences in it. There's still vocal tracks, but it's definitely got the Harold Budd structure to it. So beautiful stuff. I picked up a copy of this, which is called the Pink Opaque, because I wasn't sure if I would be able to pick up a lot of the early EPs, but this is a sort of collection that was produced, I think, just in America in the mid-'80s, like 86, I think this came out, 86, 87, something like that. And this was essentially to kind of pull in some of the material done from the earlier EPs and some of the tracks from the earlier records. And I think it was a way of just kind of introducing Cocteau Twins to Americans. But they've repressed this, and I picked it up early on because I could find it when I was looking for Cocteau Twins records, which are ridiculously hard to get. They shouldn't be that hard to get. That's followed up by Victorialand. Victorialand doesn't have Simon Raymond on it. It's just Elizabeth Fraser and Robin Guthrie. It's more of an acoustic record, and it's just the two of them. It doesn't have quite the same kind of large production value that you'd been seeing in some of the earlier EPs and records. It's beautiful, but it is more sparse. From that perspective, I find it, interesting just as a different approach. Then, so I would call everything before Treasure as sort of first phase. It's their early material. I would call everything from Treasure to Victoria Land their kind of mature career, and then everything from the next record, which is Bluebell Knoll, forward to the end of their career as their kind of polished sound. I love all three phases. I don't think that the early stuff is immature. I think it's exploratory in a way that some of the later stuff isn't. I think it's darker, which has its own appeal. The mature material is just beautiful. I think it marries the sort of darkness of the early stuff with an approaching polish. There's a lot more experimentalism in the middle of their career than you find even at the beginning of their career, and certainly at the end of their career. By the time Bluebell Knoll comes out in the late 80s, this has just such a kind of refined strength of their sound that it feels like a pop record to me, but a pop record that I'd never heard before, or really in a lot of ways since. It's kind of defining this whole new sense of what it is to make a kind of Baroque, ethereal, rich, developed pop record. It's beautiful. It feels tremendously happy, and unfortunately, I've read enough about Cocteau Twins to know that that's not necessarily the case of what was actually going on, but I'm hoping that there were moments of happiness in there, because the record just feels much more elated than what I've read about that was happening at that time. That's followed by Heaven or Las Vegas, which I believe is probably their most popular record to have come out, at least in this country. I have no idea if the UK is the same, but I believe that this was their best-selling record. Again, it kind of builds on the polish of Bluebell Knoll and produces just a gorgeous sound. It's a really stunning record. It's mature. This is coming out around the same time, if I remember right, as Loveless from My Bloody Valentine. And so it's these records that are kind of defining a new sound in that's kind of, both of those are kind of based on this sort of wall of sound aesthetic that's coming out of the late 60s, but it's developed into something completely new. Their last two albums are Four Calendar Cafe and Milk and Kisses. So these are their last two records. They are beautiful records. I never felt that they were bringing a lot new to the table with these two records. I think Heaven or Las Vegas was kind of where they peaked in that sort of polished sound of theirs. And then these are just two great examples of, you know, what they could do. By the time Milk and Kisses came out, the band was disintegrating, and they eventually broke up in the late 90s, 97 I think. And they've never reunited. They probably won't ever reunite. I think they had an offer to do some festival in the early 2000s and were signed up to do it. And then Elizabeth backed out and said she just couldn't handle it. Elizabeth Fraser and Robin Guthrie were a couple, had a child together, lots of drama. And it's unfortunate that that was a component of this, because they just made some really beautiful music together, and they've all gone on to their own careers, and I'm gonna make another video about sort of the legacy of the band and what they've done. And the last record that I wanted to mention was the BBC Sessions, which was a CD that came out in, I think, 99 and has never been produced on vinyl. But I did manage to track down a bootleg version, which is this, that's on vinyl. It's interesting, the packaging is really just, it's just a poster wrapping a record. But, you know, like Cocteau Twins fans, it's very stylish and pretty. So it's kind of cool. But I believe that the recording was probably just pulled straight from the CD. And it's not amazing, but it's totally listenable. And that's everything. So it's not quite everything. I have a couple 7 inches and 10-inch, well, that's related stuff, but not actually Cocteau Twins necessarily. Anyways, Ryan, this is probably way more of an answer than you were hoping for. But somebody just asked me about Cocteau Twins, and it gave me an excuse to talk about them. So you got to be careful what you ask for. And this is probably way too long. So for anyone who wanted a primer on Cocteau Twins, there you go. Great band, beautiful music. Take a listen to them. You won't go wrong with any record, but if you're interested in finding a place to start, I would probably start with their more polished work from Bluebell Knoll forward. If you're more familiar with post-punk and, you know, that era of things, check out the earlier stuff. It's probably a little bit more intriguing than you may have thought if you'd kind of given them a pass early on. The early stuff is kind of interesting. And then the mature stuff in the middle of their career in 84, 85, 86, in that area, it just, I think, is some of the most beautiful music ever made. Give it a try. If you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe if this was interesting to you. If you have, thank you very much, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch this, especially if you've made it this far. Anyways, see ya. Bye-bye.